The moment Beatrice Wilcox stepped onto the porch of her father's church on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1879, every man on the main street of Harlan Creek, Texas, either tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy or suddenly found something fascinating to study in the dirt beneath his boots, and not one of them dared linger long enough to hold her gaze. Harlan Creek was a town that had grown up fast, the way most Texas towns did in those years, pulled together by the promise of cattle money and railroad rumors, built plank by plank along a single main road that ran dusty in summer and muddy in winter, flanked by a saloon, a general store, a livery stable, a land office, and right at the far end, standing a little apart from everything else as though God himself had decided it deserved some breathing room, the white-painted First Baptist Church of Harlan Creek, where Reverend Silas Wilcox had preached hellfire and mercy in equal measure for 11 years. Beatrice was 22 years old, brown-eyed and sharp-minded, with dark hair that she wore in a braid down her back because she had no patience for the curling irons that other women in town tortured themselves with on Sunday mornings. She was tall for a woman of her era, with an easy stride that made her look like she was going somewhere with a purpose, which she usually was, and a direct way of speaking that occasionally made older women press their lips together and younger men forget what they had intended to say. The cowboys of Harlan Creek kept their distance from her not because they found her plain, which she was decidedly not, and not because they thought her cold, though she had the self-possession of a woman who had grown up listening to Scripture and had decided to think for herself about what it all meant. They kept their distance because of her father. Reverend Silas Wilcox was not a large man physically, but he had the voice of someone twice his size and the moral authority of someone who genuinely believed every word he preached. And in a town where most men carried at least 3 private sins, they hoped nobody would name aloud on a Sunday. That kind of authority had weight. The unspoken understanding in Harlan Creek was simple enough. You did not court Beatrice Wilcox unless you were prepared to sit across from her father and account for every dubious thing you had ever done, which, for most cowboys who drifted through Harlan Creek on their way between cattle drives and trail ends, was a conversation not worth having. So Beatrice went about her days with the peculiar loneliness of a woman who was respected but not quite pursued, who was admired from a careful distance, who helped her father copy his sermons on Wednesday evenings and ran the church's small lending library of 8 books, and organized the town's only school lessons 3 mornings a week for the children whose parents had not yet managed to get a real schoolhouse built. She did all of this with grace and without complaint because she had her mother's patience, God rest her soul, and her father's conviction that useful work was its own kind of prayer. But there was, of course, one exception to the rule. Edgar Weston rode into Harlan Creek on a Thursday afternoon in late April of 1879 on a roan horse that had seen hard miles but carried itself with dignity. Trailing behind him, a second horse loaded with a saddle roll, a bedroll, a rifle in its scabbard, and the general impression of a man who owned very little but owed nothing. He was 26. Broad through the shoulders in the way of men who have done heavy labor since boyhood, with dark eyes that had a habit of looking directly at whatever they were looking at, and a jaw that carried 3 days of beard not out of laziness, but simply because he had been riding for 3 days and had not yet stopped anywhere long enough to shave. He tied his horse at the rail outside the general store and walked inside to buy flour, dried beans, coffee, and a tin of tobacco, and it was while he was waiting for the storekeeper, a man named Clement Hodges who moved at a pace that suggested he disagreed with urgency on principle, that Beatrice Wilcox came through the door with a list in her hand, and a look on her face that said she had approximately 17 other things she needed to accomplish before the day was done. She did not notice Edgar immediately, because she was already cross-referencing her list with the shelves along the left wall, and Edgar did not speak right away, because he was a man who had learned that talking into a silence you did not own was the fastest way to wear out a welcome. He watched her work her way down the shelf, picking up a jar of molasses and examining it, setting it back, picking up another. Then she turned and nearly walked directly into him, stopped herself with one hand on the counter between them, and looked up at him with those brown eyes that held absolutely no apology in them. "I did not see you standing there," she said, which was the truth and nothing else. "You were busy," he said, which was also the truth, offered without any performance attached to it. Something in that simple exchange seemed to satisfy her, the way an honest answer sometimes satisfies a person who is accustomed to receiving elaborate ones. She nodded once, looked back at her list, and said, "Are you waiting for Mr. Hodges?" "I am." "Then you will be waiting for some time. He moves at his own pace." "I noticed that." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "Are you passing through or staying?" It was the standard question of a frontier town, the same question everyone asked every stranger, because in 1879 in Texas, the difference between someone passing through and someone staying was the difference between a temporary disruption and a permanent fact of life, and a town needed to know which kind of person it was dealing with. Edgar considered the question as though it actually required consideration, which she noticed, because most men said one or the other without thinking. "I am not certain yet," he said finally. "I came looking for work. I heard there was a rancher outside of town hiring on hands for the summer drive. That would be Mr. Aldridge. He runs the double bar spread about 4 miles east. He has been taking on hands since March. You know his operation. My father does. Mr. Aldridge is a member of our congregation. He is a fair man from everything I have heard, though he expects hard work and does not offer much patience for men who cannot deliver it." Edgar nodded slowly, as though filing this information in the correct mental drawer. "That sounds fine by me." Clement Hodges emerged at that point from the back room, with the particular energy of a man who had accomplished something modest at considerable personal cost, and he attended to Edgar's order while Beatrice collected what was on her list with the efficiency of someone who had done this particular errand perhaps 500 times and could do it blindfolded. She paid what she owed, which she counted out from a small coin purse with the care of a person who had an exact relationship with money, and she was almost to the door when she paused and looked back over her shoulder. "Mr. Hodges can point you toward the road to the double bar," she said to Edgar, "but if you get lost, the church at the end of the street is easy to find, and my father knows the way to every ranch in the county." Then she was gone, and the bell above the door swung once and went still, and Clement Hodges looked at Edgar with the expression of a man about to deliver a piece of information he found mildly entertaining. "That is the Reverend's daughter," Hodges said. "I gathered," Edgar said. "Every unmarried man in this county has enough sense to admire her from a comfortable distance." Edgar counted his change and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Is that a warning or just a piece of local color?" Hodges chuckled. "Call it both." Edgar picked up his supplies, nodded his thanks, and walked back out into the afternoon sun. He stood on the porch for a moment and looked down the street toward the white church at the far end. Then he untied his roan and swung up into the saddle and pointed it east toward the Double Bar Ranch, thinking about a woman with brown eyes who had not smiled but had come very close to it, and thinking that the work might be worth staying for. Henry Aldridge was exactly what Beatrice had described, a fair man who expected hard work. He was in his 50s, leather-faced and direct, and when Edgar rode up to the gate of the double bar the following morning, having spent the night camped on the creek bank, Aldridge looked him over with the thoroughness of a man evaluating a horse and asked him 2 questions. Could he ride and could he work? Edgar said yes to both. Aldridge hired him on the spot, offered him a bunk in the hands' quarters, 60 cents a day plus meals, and the understanding that when the summer drive started in 6 weeks, Edgar would be expected to see it through to Abilene and back. Edgar shook on it and moved his bedroll into the bunkhouse, and within 3 days he had earned the grudging respect of the other 5 hands, through the simple method of doing his share without complaining and doing it well. There was a young man named Davy Crane who was 17 and too eager by half and followed Edgar around asking questions. And there was a taciturn Mexican cowboy named Raphael who spoke little English but played the guitar beautifully on Sunday evenings. And there were 3 other men whose names were Carson, Muller, and Webb, veterans of the trail who had the calm competence of men who had seen most things and were startled by very few. On Sunday morning, Aldridge expected his hands to ride into Harlan Creek for services at the Baptist church. He was not a man who forced religion on anyone, but he attended himself as a matter of principle, and his hands attending alongside him spoke well of the double bar's reputation. And in a town where reputation was a form of currency, this mattered. Edgar had no particular quarrel with church. He had grown up in a Methodist household in Missouri before the war had rearranged his family's geography and his own future, and the rhythm of Sunday services felt like a familiar thing, which was not the same as a deeply felt thing, but it was close enough. So on the first Sunday in May, Edgar rode into Harlan Creek with the other double-bar hands and tied his roan at the rail and walked up the steps of the First Baptist Church. And the first thing he saw when he stepped inside was Beatrice Wilcox sitting at the small upright piano at the front, playing a hymn while people settled into their pews, with a concentration on her face that suggested she was doing it properly, because she cared about doing it properly rather than because anyone was watching. He took a seat near the middle and listened to her play, and then he listened to Reverend Silas Wilcox preach on the subject of honest dealing, which was a sermon that Harlan Creek needed to hear at regular intervals, because the land office down the street had recently been the site of 2 competing claims on the same quarter section, and the whole business had gotten contentious enough to require the county sheriff's intervention. The Reverend was a lean man in his late 40s with silver threading into his dark hair, and a preacher's gift for making a general principle feel like a personal instruction. And Edgar found himself paying genuine attention, which was more than he could say for most sermons he had sat through. After services, the congregation filtered out into the sunshine and arranged themselves into the informal social geography of a small town, the merchants with the merchants, the ranch families with the ranch families, the older women comparing notes on who was sick and who was recovering, and who had perhaps not been to services as regularly as they ought. Aldridge stopped to speak with the Reverend, and Edgar stood slightly apart from the group, hat in hand, watching the particular social machinery of Harlan Creek operate. Beatrice came down the church steps carrying a stack of hymnals that needed to be returned to the storage room at the side of the building, and she would have managed them perfectly well on her own, but one of them slid sideways and threatened to take the rest with it, and Edgar was close enough to step in and catch the whole stack before it arrived on the ground. "Thank you," she said, and this time she did smile, briefly and with real warmth. "They are heavier than they look." "I will take them wherever you are going," he said, which was a plain offer without the fluttery quality that Beatrice had learned to distrust in men who offered to carry things only because they wanted the excuse to walk alongside her. She looked at him for a moment, reading something in his face that seemed to satisfy her. "The storage room is around the side. Follow me." He did, and they stored the hymnals on the proper shelf, and while they were doing it she said, "You took work at the double bar then?" "I did. Mr. Aldridge is exactly what you said." "I rarely describe people inaccurately," she said, and there was no vanity in it, only a quiet statement of fact. "How are the other hands?" "Good men, mostly. Young Davy Crane asks too many questions, but he will grow out of that." She laughed at that, a genuine laugh, not the careful social laugh that women in 1879 deployed in polite company, but a real one with actual amusement in it. It was over quickly, but it had been real, and Edgar filed it away with the same care he had given to Henry Aldridge's description. "Are you staying for the Sunday dinner?" she asked, because the church ran a communal dinner after services on the first Sunday of each month, a tradition that served both the social and the practical needs of a community where people sometimes came from 20 miles away to attend and needed a meal before the ride home. "I did not know there was one," he said. "There is. My father insists on it. He says faith is not only a Sunday morning activity, and a shared meal is as much a part of worship as a hymn." She paused. "He says a lot of things like that. Does he mean them?" She considered this. "Every one of them. That is the particular quality that makes him both an excellent preacher and occasionally difficult to live with." Edgar understood what she meant, the way you understand something a person says when they are telling you a larger truth inside a smaller observation. "My father was a man like that," he said. "Not a preacher, but a man who meant everything he said." "Was. He died in 1865, the war." Something in her face adjusted, softened. "I am sorry. The war took a great many good men." "It did," Edgar said, and did not say anything more, because there was nothing more that needed to be said on the subject, and he appreciated that she did not press for it. They walked back around to the front of the church, where the Sunday dinner was beginning to arrange itself on long tables that the congregation set up in the shade of the cottonwood trees that grew along the side of the churchyard. The women laying out covered dishes, and the men setting up chairs with the cooperative efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Edgar helped without being asked, which Beatrice noticed, and he helped in the way of a man who had figured out what needed doing and did it without requiring direction, which she noticed even more. Reverend Silas Wilcox noticed the new hand from the double bar helping his congregation set up tables, and after the blessing over the meal he made his way over to introduce himself with the deliberate intentionality of a man for whom every introduction was also an assessment. "I am Silas Wilcox," he said, extending his hand. "You are one of Aldridge's new men." "Edgar Weston, sir, just hired on this week." "Where are you from, Mr. Weston?" "Originally from Missouri. I have been working cattle in Kansas and Texas for the past several years." "You have been on the trail?" "5 drives to Abilene, 2 to Dodge City." Reverend Wilcox nodded slowly, processing this the way he processed everything, with the patience of a man who believed in thorough understanding. "You attended services this morning?" "Yes, sir. Your sermon on honest dealing was well considered." The Reverend's eyes sharpened slightly, the way a teacher's eyes sharpen when a student says something that suggests actual comprehension rather than polite attendance. "You have an opinion on the subject?" "Only that it is easier to preach than to practice in circumstances where the temptation runs the other direction. I thought you acknowledged that honestly, which made the instruction more useful than most." There was a pause. Reverend Wilcox looked at him with an expression that Edgar could not quite read, somewhere between assessment and something warmer. "Sit with us for dinner, Mr. Weston," the Reverend said. "I want to hear more about what you think." Beatrice, who had been near enough to overhear this entire exchange while pretending to arrange the plates at the near end of the table, looked up and caught Edgar's eyes for just a moment before looking back down, and the expression on her face was one of genuine surprise, because, in all her memory, she could not recall her father inviting a cowboy he had just met to sit at the family table with quite that warmth in his voice. Dinner was long and generous, the way communal meals in church communities tended to be, with platters of roasted chicken and cornbread and dried apple pie, and 3 kinds of preserved vegetables from last fall's harvest. Edgar sat across from Beatrice and next to Reverend Wilcox, and the conversation moved from theology to cattle prices to the question of whether the railroad would come through the southern part of the county as had been rumored since the previous winter. And Edgar held his own in all of it without performing or embellishing, speaking when he had something to say and listening with visible interest when he did not. And Beatrice watched all of this with the particular attention of a woman who has been disappointed by pretension, often enough to recognize its absence as something rare. After dinner, while the women cleared the tables and the men stood in the warm afternoon talking, Beatrice found herself beside Edgar at the edge of the churchyard, both of them watching Davy Crane attempt to demonstrate some feat of horsemanship on the road that resulted in him narrowly avoiding falling off his horse, which the other double-bar hands found enormously amusing. "He is going to hurt himself eventually," Beatrice said. "Almost certainly," Edgar agreed. "But not today, I think. He is actually a better rider than he appears when he is showing off. How long have you been reading people that way?" He turned to look at her. It was a direct question, the kind she asked without apparently realizing that other people might consider them intrusive, but he did not find it intrusive. He found it honest. "Since I was young," he said. "I grew up with a lot of different kinds of people after my father died. You learn to read a room fast when you are not always sure whose room it is." "That sounds lonely," she said, and she said it the way she said most things, without decoration, just the simple observation placed between them as a fact rather than a piece of sentiment. "It was," he said, "for a while." She looked at him for a moment and then looked back at Davy Crane, who had settled his horse and was now trying to look as though the near fall had been intentional. "Harlan Creek is a small town," she said. "People here have long memories and strong opinions about what is proper and what is not. Most men who come through are careful to be on their best behavior with me specifically. I notice they take their hats off very quickly when you walk past," he said. "My father is well regarded." "That is part of it," he said, and let the rest of the sentence sit unfinished. But she heard what was in the unspoken part, and a small color came into her cheeks that she did not bother to hide. "You are not going to be careful in the same way, are you?" she said, and it was not quite a question. "I am going to be respectful," he said. "That is not the same thing as keeping my distance." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "No, I suppose it is not." And then she excused herself to help carry dishes back inside, and Edgar watched her go with the settled feeling of a man who has just made a decision he intends to honor. The weeks that followed had the quality of a slow fire, which is to say that the warmth built gradually enough that you could almost miss it if you were not paying attention. But if you were paying attention, you could see it clearly from the beginning. Edgar rode into town on Saturday evenings when the day's work at the double bar was done, not for the saloon, where he might have a single beer and a quiet seat, but increasingly for the deliberate purpose of finding some excuse to be in the same part of town as the church at the end of the street. He brought his horse to the livery stable that was run by a man named Otto Brauer, who had come from Germany 20 years ago and had the self-contained quality of a man who had reinvented himself in a new country and was satisfied with the result. And while his horse was attended to, Edgar would find some reason to walk past the church. And sometimes Beatrice was on the porch, and sometimes she was not. And when she was not, he went to the saloon and had his beer and went back to the double bar. And when she was, they talked. They talked about books, because Beatrice ran the lending library and had actually read all 8 of the books in it multiple times and had opinions about every one of them. They talked about the question of whether the town needed a schoolhouse before winter, or whether the 3 mornings a week in the church hall were adequate, a question that Beatrice had strong feelings about, and that Edgar, who had made up most of his own education from whatever came to hand, also cared about more than she had expected. They talked about the nature of faith, which Beatrice held sincerely but not simply, and about the nature of work, which Edgar understood with the authority of a man who had done a great deal of it. Once, on a warm Saturday evening in late May, they sat on the church steps while the sun went down behind the western ridge and turned the whole sky the color of copper and ash, and Beatrice told him about her mother, who had died of fever when Beatrice was 14, and the way the town had come together around her father in the weeks afterward, which had been the first time she truly understood what a community was for. Edgar listened without interrupting, which she appreciated more than she said. "Your mother sounds like a woman of substance," he said when she had finished. "She was the most substantial person I have ever known," Beatrice said. "My father is extraordinary in his way, but my mother was the kind of person who made a room feel different by being in it. Not louder or more commanding, just more real, like everything had more weight and more color when she was present. "I understand that," he said quietly, and she thought he might say something more, but he did not, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable but full, the way a silence is when both people in it are thinking the same kind of thought. "Edgar," she said, and his name in her voice had a quality that was different from how anyone else had ever said it, neither formal nor familiar, but something that fit exactly in between. "Why did you not take work elsewhere? You could have gone anywhere. The cattle country runs for 500 miles in any direction." He looked at her steadily. "I had a reason to stay in this particular place," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. "My father will want to know your intentions," she said, with the directness that was simply her way of moving through the world. "Your father already has a fair idea of my intentions," Edgar said. "He has been watching me every Sunday for a month, and I think he is a man who does not miss much." She was quiet for a moment. "He likes you," she said, and the surprise in her voice was not ungentle. "He does not say it directly, because he is my father and he feels it is his responsibility to be measured about such things, but I can tell when he likes someone." "I like him," Edgar said honestly. "He is a man who means what he says, which I told you I respect. He will still want a conversation." "I know. I intend to have it." She looked at him, and something in her face was very open in that moment, unguarded in the way that a person is only when they have decided they can afford to be. "You have not even asked me if I would welcome your intentions," she said. "No," he agreed. "That is the conversation I want to have with you first before I speak to your father. It seems to me the natural order of things." Something in her expression shifted, something warm and unguarded that she did not try to rearrange. "Then ask," she said softly. "Beatrice," he said, and her name in his voice was as steady as the way he did everything, "would you welcome my intentions?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation and without drama, just the clean, honest answer of a woman who had already done the thinking and had arrived at her conclusion. "Yes, I would." The following Sunday, Edgar presented himself at the Reverend's study after services, hat in hand, and had the conversation. Reverend Silas Wilcox sat behind his desk, and Edgar sat in the chair across from it, and the Reverend asked him about his history, his prospects, his faith, and his character, all in the methodical way of a man conducting the most important interview he had ever conducted. And Edgar answered everything honestly, including the parts that were not flattering, because he had decided from the beginning that honesty was the only basis on which anything worthwhile could be built with this family. He told the Reverend about his childhood in Missouri, about his father's death, about the years of wandering through Kansas and Texas doing trail work and fighting work, and whatever other honest work came to hand. He told him that he had saved money over 5 years of trail driving and had enough to put down on a modest piece of land if he found the right piece in the right place. He told the Reverend that he respected his daughter and intended to court her with the straightforwardness that she deserved, and that he had no interest in hurrying anything or in being less than completely transparent about where things were headed. The Reverend listened to all of it. He asked 3 follow-up questions. Then he was quiet for a long moment, and Edgar waited because he had learned that the Reverend's silences were usually working silences rather than empty ones. "My daughter," the Reverend said at last, "is not a woman who needs to be protected from honest men. She is perfectly capable of making her own assessments. What she needs is a man who understands that her independence of mind is not a problem to be managed, but a quality to be honored." "I understand that already," Edgar said. "Do you?" the Reverend said, and it was less a question than a measurement. "She told me about the schoolhouse question, about whether 3 mornings a week in the church hall is adequate," Edgar said. "She told me she wants a real schoolhouse built before winter, and she laid out her argument for it with better logic than most lawyers I have encountered. I told her she was right, and that if there was any way I could be useful to that effort after the summer drive, I would be. She did not need me to tell her she was right. She had already arrived there herself. But I wanted her to know that someone with a stake in the outcome, agreed with her reasoning. The Reverend looked at him for another long moment, and then something in the man's face relaxed by a degree, like a beam that has been under tension deciding it can bear the weight after all. "You may court my daughter, Mr. Weston," he said. "I will be watching because I am her father and that is my duty, but I give you my permission." Edgar stood and shook the Reverend's hand, and the grip the older man offered was firm and genuine, and Edgar walked out of the study into the morning sunlight where Beatrice was waiting on the front steps with her hands folded in front of her, and an expression on her face that was carefully composed but not entirely successful at concealing the fact that she had been very interested in what was happening on the other side of that door. "Well," she said. "He gave his permission," Edgar said. She let out a breath that she had been holding for what appeared to be some time, and then she laughed, that real laugh he had come to value greatly, and she looked up at him with her brown eyes warm and bright, and Edgar thought that whatever else happened in his life, he wanted to keep finding ways to earn that laugh. Courting Beatrice Wilcox in the spring and early summer of 1879 was the kind of slow and careful pleasure that a man who had lived without much permanence had not quite allowed himself to imagine was possible. They walked together after Sunday dinners along the creek road that ran behind the church, always within sight of the town, because propriety required it, and because neither of them felt the need to rush past the stages that led somewhere worth arriving at. They sat on the church porch on Saturday evenings, talking, and their conversations built on themselves the way conversations do when both people in them are genuinely paying attention, each new topic connecting to the last, each exchange revealing something that the previous one had prepared the ground for. Beatrice told him about the book she loved most, a novel she had gotten from a traveling bookseller 3 years ago that she had read 5 times, and about the way it made her think about what it meant to have a self that was entirely your own even when everyone around you expected you to fit a particular shape. Edgar told her about the time on a cattle drive north of the Red River, when the trail boss had gotten a fever, and the whole operation had fallen to the hands to figure out, and how they had navigated it by each person doing what they knew best without anyone having to appoint a leader, and what that had taught him about the difference between authority and competence. She asked him once on a warm evening in June what he wanted his life to look like in 10 years, and he answered without hesitation because he had been thinking about it. "A piece of land," he said. "Not a vast operation, something I can manage and know every inch of, good horses, honest work, and a house with a kitchen that gets the morning light because I have noticed that most things are better if you start the day with the sun coming through a window." She was quiet for a moment. "And people," she said. "What do you want the people in that life to look like?" He looked at her directly. "I am sitting next to the person I want in that life," he said, simply and without decoration, the way he said everything. She looked at the creek, which was catching the last light of the evening in its slow bends, and she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "I want the schoolhouse," and he understood that she was telling him something important, not just about a building but about herself, about what she needed her life to contain beyond what convention expected from a woman of her time and station. "The schoolhouse," he said, "can be both things." She turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "A school needs a teacher," he said, "and you are already teaching. The fact that you are also a wife does not dissolve that. It just means you teach in a building with proper walls and a stove instead of in the church hall." He paused. "If that is what you want, I see no reason it should not be what you have." She was looking at him with an expression that he would think about for the rest of his life, a kind of recognition, as though she had been describing a thing to herself for a long time and had finally found someone who could see the same picture. "Most men would not think that way," she said. "I am not interested in being most men," he said, and the simplicity of it made her eyes go bright in a way that had nothing to do with the light on the creek. The summer drive to Abilene departed from the Double Bar on the 15th of June, and the departure of the cattle drive was a significant event in the life of Harlan Creek, the kind of thing that the whole town turned out to watch, because it was a visual reminder of what all the economic life of the region was organized around. The long-horned Texas cattle moving north through the dust, the cowboys riding alongside, the smell of cattle and leather, and the particular energy of a long journey beginning. Beatrice stood on the porch of the general store and watched the drive pass through the edge of town, and Edgar rode past with the other double-bar hands, and he touched the brim of his hat to her as he passed, and she raised her hand once, a small direct gesture, and the warmth in it crossed the distance between them as clearly as if they had been standing side by side. Reverend Wilcox, who was standing beside his daughter, watched this exchange with the quiet attention he brought to all things, and he said nothing, but he put one hand briefly on Beatrice's shoulder and left it there for a moment, and she leaned into it slightly, just for a moment, the way a person leans into the presence of someone who knows what they are feeling without needing to be told. The summer without Edgar had a particular texture that Beatrice had not anticipated. She had known him for only 2 months, which was a brief time by any measure, but the town had a different feel to it in his absence, and she found herself aware of the difference in a way that surprised her. She threw herself into the schoolhouse campaign with renewed energy, gathering signatures on a petition, making the case to the town council in the plain-spoken way that had made her father's parishioners trust her. And by July, she had commitments from enough people to begin planning the construction of a modest one-room schoolhouse to stand on the lot behind the church. She wrote letters. She wrote 2 letters to Edgar over the summer, care of the drover's office in Abilene, because she knew the drive would reach Kansas by July and the letters might find him there. She wrote them the same way she talked, directly and without embellishment, telling him about the schoolhouse progress and about a book she had gotten from the traveling bookseller who came through in late June, and about the particular quality of the summer sky over Harlan Creek in the evenings when the heat had eased, and the light turned everything gold and generous. She did not say that she missed him exactly, but she described things in the letters with the extra specificity of a person who is writing for a particular reader, and that said everything. He wrote back from Abilene, 2 letters on paper that still smelled slightly of trail dust, with handwriting that was better than she had expected, clear and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write carefully because he intended to be understood. He wrote about the drive, about the particular quality of the Kansas landscape, about a storm on the open plain that had kept them circling the herd for a night and a day. He wrote about a conversation he had had with Raphael the guitarist about what home meant to a man who had been traveling for most of his adult life, and what Raphael had said, which was that home was not a place but a direction, not where you were but where you were pointed. He said that he had thought about that for several days and that he believed he understood what it meant now. He did not say he loved her. It was 1879, and he was a man of considered movement rather than impulsive declaration, and they had been courting for 2 months, and the letters were delivered through a public drover's office, and he was a man who respected her. But what he wrote in that last letter was that, when the drive reached Abilene and he had his pay in his pocket, he intended to look into land prices in Harlan Creek County, because he had a reason to be particular about the geography of his future, and he thought Harlan Creek might be exactly the right kind of particular. The drive came back to the double bar in the middle of August, the cattle having been sold in Kansas, and the hands returning with their pay and the particular lean, weathered look of men who had spent 2 months on the trail. Edgar rode into Harlan Creek on a Saturday evening, still trail dusty, and went first to the livery to settle his horse, and then he walked to the barber shop and had himself shaved for the first time in weeks, and then he walked the length of the main street to the church at the far end, and found Beatrice on the porch with a lamp burning and a book in her hand, and she looked up when she heard his step on the stairs. She stood up from her chair, and he stopped at the top of the porch steps, and they looked at each other for a moment in the warm evening light, with the moth circles the lamp and the creek making its quiet sound somewhere behind the church. And neither of them said anything for a moment. And then she said, "You are back." And her voice had something in it that all her practiced composure could not quite contain. "I said I would be," he said, and he reached out and took her hand, the first time he had done so, and she let him. And the warmth of his hand around hers was exactly as solid and real as she had known it would be. "The schoolhouse foundation was laid last week," she said, and she said it as though she was offering it to him, because in a way she was, this piece of news from the life they were building toward. "I saw it as I came through," he said. "It is going to be good." "It is going to be very good," she agreed, and something in the confidence of her voice made him smile, the full smile, the one that changed his face in a way that she had been thinking about since the first Sunday after he came to Harlan Creek. He called on Reverend Wilcox the following morning, Sunday, before services, and the Reverend received him in his study and they shook hands, and the Reverend said, "You look like the trail," and Edgar said, "I came back from it," and the Reverend said, "Yes, you did," and the weight of what was understood between them in that exchange needed no further elaboration. After services, in the shade of the cottonwood trees while the Sunday dinner assembled itself around them, Edgar asked if he could speak with Beatrice privately, and the Reverend nodded without making it a performance, and found something to attend to on the other side of the churchyard. They walked to the end of the church garden, where the wild sunflowers had grown tall along the fence, and the sound of the congregation socializing reached them only softly. Edgar turned to face her, and he had his hat in his hands, which was how she had first seen him, and she thought, with a clarity that felt like sunshine through clean glass, that she had known from very nearly the beginning that this moment was coming. "I have been to see the land office," he said. "There is a piece of land available about 2 miles west of the Double Bar, along Peavy Creek, 40 acres, with a natural spring and a stand of good timber on the north end. It is priced fairly." She looked at him. "You are going to buy it?" "I want to buy it," he said. "I have the money from the drive. I have enough to put down the land and still have enough to build something on it." "Something," she said. "A house," he said. "A house with a kitchen that gets the morning light, because I told you that was what I wanted." She was very still and her eyes were very bright, and the summer heat was pressing down on the afternoon, and the sunflowers were swaying slightly in the warm air, and she said, "Edgar, I want to build it for us," he said, "if you will have me. I want to ask your father for the right to marry you if you want that. But I wanted to ask you first. I always wanted to ask you first." She looked at him for a long moment. This steady, honest, quiet man with the dark eyes that looked at whatever they looked at without evasion. And she thought about her father's faith and her mother's strength, and the 8 books in the lending library, and the schoolhouse foundation that had been laid last week, and all the years she had spent in this small town being admired from a careful distance by men who were afraid of her father, or afraid of her, or afraid of some combination of the two. And here was a man who was afraid of none of those things, and had simply walked through the distance everyone else maintained, and said hello with the expectation that she would say hello back. "Yes," she said, and it came out the way important things do when you have been thinking them for a long time, with all the weight of that accumulated certainty behind it. "Yes, Edgar, that is what I want." He reached out and took her face in his hands, gently, with the same care he brought to everything, and kissed her for the first time, brief and warm. And when he stepped back his eyes were bright, and his breathing was slightly altered, and she thought she had never seen anything more real in her life than this man standing in the church garden in the August heat looking at her, as though she were the direction he had been pointed toward for a long time and had finally arrived. Reverend Wilcox received Edgar's formal request that evening over supper, which the Reverend had insisted Edgar stay for, as though he already knew what was coming and had decided to make it a proper occasion. Edgar asked clearly, holding the Reverend's gaze across the kitchen table, for Beatrice's hand in marriage, and the Reverend looked at his daughter, who looked back at him with her brown eyes steady and warm, And then the Reverend looked back at Edgar and said, "You have my blessing, Mr. Weston. You have had it for some time, I think." Edgar bought the land along Peavy Creek the following week, paying the land office clerk, a thin, nervous man named Sotheby, who seemed mildly overwhelmed by the number of signatures required, with the patient deliberateness of a man performing an act he considers significant. He rode out to the property and walked every inch of it on a clear September morning, and he stood at the spring and listened to the water and looked at the timber on the north ridge, and the way the slope faced east so that the morning sun would fall full on the front of whatever he built there, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time, or perhaps had never felt quite this way. The sensation of a future that was his own and freely chosen, and shared with a person he had chosen with his whole mind as well as his heart. He spent September building. The double-bar hands were between drives, and Aldridge gave him leave to work his own property during the weeks between the end of the summer drive and the planning for the fall work, and Davy Crane and Raphael both came out on their days off to help, because a man helping build his own house was a project that the bunkhouse considered collective in spirit even if it was private in ownership. Clement Hodges at the general store gave him credit on building materials without being asked, which was the closest thing to a wedding gift the old storekeeper knew how to offer. The house went up in 6 weeks. It was modest, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a covered porch on the front, built of timber from the ridge and with a stone fireplace that Edgar built himself, laying each stone with the care of someone who intends the thing to last longer than his own lifetime. He built the kitchen on the east side, with 2 windows, so that the morning light would come through the way he had promised, and he built a porch with enough room for 2 chairs and a view of the creek bend, because it seemed important to him that there should be a place to sit at the end of the day and look at something peaceful. Beatrice came out to see it in October, brought by her father in the wagon, and she walked through every room with her careful attention, her hand moving along the window sills and the fireplace stones. And when she came to the kitchen, she stood in the rectangle of morning sun that came through the east-facing windows, even though it was afternoon by then and only imagination could supply the light, and she said, "It is exactly right," and Edgar, who had been watching her with the slightly held-breath quality of a man whose work is being reviewed by the person whose opinion matters most, felt the tension go out of his shoulders and replaced by something warmer. They were married in the First Baptist Church of Harlan Creek on the 3rd Saturday of November, 1879. The entire congregation attended, because a marriage in a small-town church is a community event, not only a private one, and because Beatrice was the Reverend's daughter and Edgar had, over the 7 months since he rode into town, made himself a known and respected presence. Davy Crane and Raphael and Carson and Muller and Webb all sat in the second row on the groom's side, uncomfortable in their good shirts, and Henry Aldridge sat behind them with his wife and nodded to himself with the satisfaction of a man who feels he made a good hire. Beatrice wore her mother's dress, which the Reverend had kept in a trunk since 1871, and had offered to her that morning with a simplicity that undid her completely, though she recovered herself with the same composure that had carried her through most of the harder things in her life. The dress was cream-colored, slightly old-fashioned in its style, and it fit her as though it had been made for her, and she walked down the aisle of her father's church on his arm with the certainty of a woman who has thought carefully about a decision and arrived at the correct one. Edgar stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him, and whatever he was thinking was visible on his face in a way that he made no effort to conceal. And Davy Crane leaned over to Raphael and whispered something, and Raphael nodded with the expression of a man who understands what he is witnessing. The Reverend married them himself, which required a particular steadiness of character that he maintained throughout, though at the exchange of vows his voice had a quality that was slightly different from its Sunday sermon quality, warmer and less projected, as though he were speaking just for the three of them in that moment rather than for the assembled congregation. Edgar's voice was steady when he made his vows, the same steadiness he brought to everything, which Beatrice found more moving than any dramatic gesture would have been, because it was entirely him. They spoke their vows as the November light came through the church windows, and the congregation sat in that particular quiet that happens when people are witnessing something genuine. And then the Reverend said the words that closed it, and Edgar kissed his wife in front of God and her father and the whole congregation of Harlan Creek. And when he stepped back, they were both smiling in the way of people who have been moving toward a moment for a long time and have finally arrived there. The reception afterward was held in the church hall, which had been decorated by the women of the congregation with ribbons and dried flowers, and 2 long tables of food that represented the collective cooking talent of a Texas church community in 1879, which was considerable. Edgar danced with his wife to the fiddle music that old Thomas Pritchett played in the corner, and he was not a polished dancer, which she had suspected, but he moved with the same sure-footed competence he brought to everything physical, and he held her with a steadiness that made the imperfect dancing feel like exactly the right thing. Reverend Wilcox danced 1 reel with his daughter and then stepped back and watched her with Edgar for a long time, and his face held the particular mixture of completion and loss that belongs to parents who are doing their job properly. And then old Nellie Fitch from the congregation appeared beside him with a plate of food and told him to sit down and eat something. And he did, with the docility of a man who has been successfully managed. They drove out to the house on Peavy Creek in the wagon that evening, and the stars were out in the Texas winter sky with the particular clarity of a night that has lost the haze of summer, and the creek made its sound in the dark as they came up the road toward the house. And the house was dark, but Edgar had laid a fire that morning before going into town, and it needed only a match to bring it to life. He held the lamp while she opened the front door, the first time the front door of their house was opened by someone coming home rather than by someone building it, and she crossed the threshold and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the lamplight, and the fire caught and threw its warm color across the walls, and she turned to look at him standing in the doorway of his own house, their house, and she said, "Come in, then," and he did. The winter of 1879 settled over Harlan Creek with the moderate severity of a Texas winter, which is to say there were cold weeks and clear weeks, and some days of sleet that made the road through town a misery, and some days of pale winter sunshine that made the land look like it was resting rather than frozen. Edgar worked the double bar through the winter, because Aldridge needed hands for the cold weather maintenance of the herd, and Edgar needed the wages to supplement what they had saved. And Beatrice taught in the new schoolhouse, which had been finished in October and opened in November, and now served 14 children from the surrounding farms and ranches 3 mornings a week. She was an excellent teacher, which everyone who witnessed it agreed upon, because she had the same quality with children that she had with adults, the directness and the genuine interest and the expectation that people could understand things if the things were explained clearly. And she held her students to high standards not by intimidation, but by the example of her own obvious love of learning, which was contagious in the way that genuine enthusiasm usually is. Edgar came home to her in the evenings with the particular pleasure of a man who has spent his whole adult life coming back to a bunkhouse or a campfire, and now comes back to a kitchen with light in the windows, and a woman whose company is one of the genuine gifts of his life. They ate supper together and talked about their days and read in the evenings by the fire, Beatrice from whatever book she was working through and Edgar from the almanac, and the occasional newspaper that made it out from San Antonio 3 days late, and was read twice before it was used for kindling. In February, Beatrice told Edgar quietly on a Tuesday morning while he was drinking his coffee that she believed she was expecting, and he set down his cup with great care and looked at her and said nothing for a moment, only looked at her with his dark eyes, holding everything he felt in a way that was more eloquent than speech. And then he stood up and came around the table, and held her in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the east windows exactly as promised. And she leaned into him and felt the solidity of him, and thought that whatever happened next, they were going to be all right. Spring came back to Harlan Creek in March of 1880 with the wildflowers first, the Indian paintbrush and the bluebonnets coming up in the pastures, and then the cottonwood trees coming back to green, and the creek running high from the winter rains. Beatrice continued teaching until June, because she was perfectly capable of standing in front of 14 children and teaching them long division while her body quietly performed its own most extraordinary work, and she saw no reason to stop until it was actually necessary. Reverend Wilcox came out to the house on Peavy Creek every Sunday after services, riding the 4 miles on his steady old mare, because he was a man who believed in being present in the lives of his family, and Edgar had come to genuinely value these Sunday visits, which had a character of their own, the 3 of them at the kitchen table or on the porch depending on the weather, talking about everything that had happened in the week. The Reverend bringing news from town and Edgar bringing news from the ranch, and Beatrice connecting all of it with the sharp observational intelligence that made both her father and her husband capable of seeing things they might have missed. There was a complication in April that needed attending to. A man arrived in Harlan Creek named Clement Dawes, who had a prior claim on a portion of the land that Edgar had purchased the previous fall, a claim that Dawes said had been incorrectly handled by the land office when Edgar's purchase was processed. Sotheby at the land office, when confronted with this, became more than usually nervous and produced paperwork that was ambiguous at best, and the whole business threatened to become the kind of dispute that had a way of turning unpleasant in a land-hungry Texas county. Edgar did not panic and did not overreact. He went to the land office and read every piece of paper carefully, and found that Dawes' prior claim was for the northwest quarter section, which was not the 40 acres Edgar had purchased, and that the confusion had arisen from a recording error that Sotheby had made when filing the original grant. He presented this finding to the county judge, a man named Hargrove who had been on the bench long enough to have seen every variety of land dispute and was tired of most of them. And Judge Hargrove reviewed the documents and agreed with Edgar's reading and told Dawes that his claim was on different land entirely, and that if he had complaints about how it had been recorded, he needed to take them up with Sotheby rather than with Mr. Weston. Dawes was not pleased, but he was also not so unreasonable that he could not see when a legal argument had been settled against him, and he took himself and his complaint to the land office, where Sotheby received him with the terrified energy of a small man confronted by a large problem of his own making, and the matter was resolved within a week with the correction of the original recording error and Edgar's deed standing uncontested. Edgar told Beatrice about it that evening at supper with the calmness of a man who had handled a problem through proper channels and found the proper channels adequate, and she listened and asked 2 sharp questions that got to the essential legal point immediately, and when he confirmed that the deed was secure, she nodded once and served him a second helping of the rabbit stew she had made and said, "Good. I did not want to move the kitchen." He laughed, the full laugh that was as rare and genuine in him as her own, and they ate supper together in the kitchen, with the evening coming through the windows, and the land was theirs, and the house was theirs, and the child was coming in September, and the difficulty had been met and handled, and the evening was simple and good in the way that evenings are when the complicated parts of the day are finished. Davy Crane came out to the ranch on a Saturday in May, and stayed for supper and afterward on the porch, told them that he had met a girl from the Hartwell farm north of town, a girl named Anna Hartwell who was 17, and who he was very taken with, and whose father he intended to speak to in the fall when he had his summer drive wages saved. Edgar listened to this with the seriousness it deserved, which was the seriousness of a young man's first serious feeling, and told Davy that intentions were good, but savings were better, and that if he truly intended to build something with a woman he needed to have more than his intentions to offer. Davy took this in with the slightly wounded but ultimately receptive quality of a young man receiving advice from someone he respects, and nodded and said he knew Edgar was right, and then he ate 2 more pieces of Beatrice's cornbread and helped Edgar mend a section of fence before he rode back to the double bar. "He will be all right," Beatrice said that evening. "He will," Edgar agreed. "He just needs a season or 2 to grow into his own sense. You sound like my father." "Your father is a wise man." She smiled at him across the kitchen. "Do not tell him that too often. His sermons are already long enough." The summer of 1880 moved forward with the steady warmth of the Texas plains, and Edgar went on the summer drive again, this time as lead hand, which Aldridge had offered him as a recognition of both his competence and his character. It meant more responsibility and somewhat more pay, and it meant leaving Beatrice in July when she was 6 months along, which he did not do without real difficulty. The night before he left, they sat on the porch in the warm July dark, and he held her hand, and she rested her head against his shoulder, and they watched the creek bend in the starlight, and she said, "I will be fine. My father will look in on me, and Mrs. Aldridge has offered to come out twice a week, and I am not a woman who falls apart at the first difficult thing." "I know that," he said. "I do not doubt you for a moment, I just do not want to miss it." She was quiet for a moment. "If the baby comes before you are back, I will make sure your son or daughter knows that you were riding hard to get home." He turned to look at her. "You think it is a boy?" "I think you want a boy, and I have decided to be diplomatic about it," she said. And he laughed and she laughed, and he held her carefully in the July dark and memorized the weight and warmth of her against his side. He rode out with the drive the following morning, and she stood on the porch and watched him go, the same small direct wave she had given him the first time, the year before, and he touched his hat brim in the same way, and they were both aware that this particular moment was an echo of the very first parting they had watched each other through, but everything surrounding it was different now. The land was theirs, and the house was theirs, and the child was coming, and the wave carried a different weight than it had carried before. He came back from Abilene in mid-August, riding hard the last 2 days because something in him needed to be home before September, and he tied his roan at the fence post and walked up to the house and opened the door and found Beatrice sitting at the kitchen table with her feet up on a second chair and a book in her hand, and the evening light coming through the east windows at its long late summer angle. And she looked up at him with the expression she reserved for moments when something she had been waiting for had arrived, and she said, "You are back early." "I rode fast," he said. "I noticed," she said, and smiled, and he crossed the kitchen and crouched beside her chair and put one hand carefully on the curve of her belly, and she put her hand over his, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing that needed to be said. The baby came on the 2nd of September, 1880, 2 days into the month, in the bedroom of the house on Peavy Creek, attended by the doctor from Harlan Creek, a competent man named Mallory who had been delivering babies in this county for 12 years, and by the Reverend's housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, who had helped with more births than the doctor and whose calm authority in a birthing room was one of the genuinely useful facts of life in that community. Edgar waited on the porch through the long hours, which was what was expected of men in 1880, and which he endured with the focused stillness of a man who has trained himself to wait under difficult circumstances, but found this particular waiting different from any other kind he had done. When Mrs. Crane opened the door and told him he could come in, he walked through the bedroom door and found Beatrice propped against the pillows with the pale, shining quality of someone who has been through something tremendous and come out the other side, and in her arms was a baby with a round red face and a surprising amount of dark hair, and the baby was making the small searching sounds of a person who is brand new to the world and finding it louder than expected. "A boy," Beatrice said. "You can stop being diplomatic." Edgar sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife, and the expression on his face was the one that did not have a name, but that everyone who has seen a person in that particular moment recognizes: the complete and undivided astonishment of someone encountering something they did not know the full dimensions of until it was actually in front of them. "Is he well?" Edgar asked Dr. Mallory. "He is excellent," Mallory said. "Healthy and loud, which is the ideal combination in a newborn. And Beatrice, she is strong," Mallory said. "She was sensible about the whole business, which helps considerably." Beatrice looked at her husband with the exhausted warmth of someone who has recently performed a miracle and is now ready to be allowed to hold her son in peace. "I told you I would be fine," she said. "You did," he agreed. He reached out and touched the baby's dark hair carefully, with one finger, the way you touch something you are afraid of disturbing. The baby turned his face toward the touch with the blind instinct of the newborn, and Edgar's finger was briefly captured in one very small fist. They named him James, for Edgar's father, and Silas as a middle name, for Reverend Wilcox, who received this information 2 days later when he came out to the farm on his Sunday visit, and held his grandson in the kitchen with the particular expression of a man who understands completely that God has been generous with him, even accounting for all the loss. The Reverend held James Silas Weston for a long time and did not try to say anything about it, which was unlike him in the best possible way, and Beatrice watched her father hold her son, with the feeling that the room contained everything most important in her life. And Edgar stood in the kitchen doorway with his coffee in his hand, and watched his family be together in the morning light that came through the east windows. And the life he had wanted was exactly the life he had. And it was more than he had known how to want when he first imagined it. The schoolhouse became the centerpiece of the following year. The 14 students became 20 by the spring of 1881, as more families settled in the surrounding county, and the original small building began to strain at its seams. Beatrice taught 6 mornings a week by then, because she was constitutionally incapable of stopping at 3 when there was more to be done, and she brought James Silas to the schoolhouse with her, where he spent his mornings in a basket near her desk, and eventually on a blanket on the floor, and the older children competed fiercely for the honor of watching him while Beatrice worked with the younger ones at the board. Edgar had transitioned by the spring of 1881 from working for the double bar to running his own 40 acres as a going operation, having bought 6 cows in the fall, and started building the herd with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. The land along Peavy Creek was good land, and the spring kept it fed even in dry years, and the timber on the North Ridge gave good windbreak, and Edgar worked it with the satisfaction of a man who knows every inch of what he is responsible for and has chosen that responsibility freely. Henry Aldridge, who had retired from active trail driving after a knee injury the previous winter, came out to the Peavy Creek farm twice in the spring to look at what Edgar had built and made approving sounds, and told Edgar that he had an eye for land management that some men took 30 years to develop. Edgar thanked him and offered him coffee, and they talked about cattle prices for an hour on the porch. And when Aldridge left, he shook Edgar's hand and said he was glad Edgar had stopped in Harlan Creek, which was the warmest thing Aldridge had ever said to anyone, and Edgar received it accordingly. Davy Crane did, in fact, court Anna Hartwell, and did it with somewhat more preparation and patience than his character had originally suggested he was capable of. And by the summer of 1881, he came out to the Peavy Creek farm on a Sunday afternoon with Anna Hartwell beside him on his horse, a small dark-haired girl with a direct manner, and an evident fondness for Davy that she made no effort to conceal, and told Edgar and Beatrice that he had spoken to Mr. Hartwell and had his blessing, and that they intended to marry in the fall. Beatrice received this with genuine pleasure and made tea, and the 4 of them sat on the porch and talked, and Edgar watched Davy Crane sitting beside his girl with the settled look of a young man who has grown into himself, and felt the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a process complete itself well. Raphael had gone south in the winter of 1880, back toward the border, carrying his guitar and the recommendation letter that Edgar had written for him to a ranch operation down in Uvalde County, and they had exchanged letters twice since then, the letters between them having the character of men who do not write often but mean every word when they do. In the last letter, Raphael had written that he was well and that the Uvalde operation was fair, and that he had met a woman who played the guitar better than he did, and that he intended to find out more about her. And Edgar had shown the letter to Beatrice, and she had laughed her real laugh, and said that she hoped the woman in Uvalde knew what a good man she was being visited by. The schoolhouse expansion was approved by the town council in the summer of 1881. A second room added to the original building, which meant 2 classrooms and the possibility of a second teacher for the upper grades. Beatrice managed both rooms herself for the first semester, while the town searched for a qualified teacher for the second, and she managed it with the energy of a woman who had decided that the thing she was building was important enough to carry on her own shoulders for as long as it required. Edgar came in 3 evenings a week to help her organize the materials for the following day, and they worked together at the schoolhouse table while James Silas slept in his basket nearby. And the work was good work, and the company was the best company either of them had ever had. The second teacher arrived in the fall of 1881, a young woman from Dallas named Clara Stokes, who was 23, and had genuine qualifications and a nervous quality that settled into competence once she had a few weeks to find her footing. Beatrice welcomed her with the practical warmth of someone who has been doing a job alone and is relieved to have reliable help, and Clara Stokes proved to be an excellent teacher of the upper grades and a good neighbor, and the 2 women developed an alliance of the kind that forms between people who respect each other's competence. The second autumn, 1881, brought a change in the air over Harlan Creek in a larger sense. The railroad finally arrived, or rather the news arrived that the railroad would come through the county in the spring of 1882, which meant land prices shifted and new people began arriving, and the town that had been Harlan Creek for 11 years began to feel itself becoming something larger. The general store doubled its stock. A second saloon opened on the east end of the main street. A lawyer set up an office between the land office and the barber shop. A hotel was proposed, and its construction begun before winter. Beatrice watched all of this with the interest of someone who understands that change is the price of progress, but also its complication. She talked about it with Edgar on the porch in the evenings, James Silas between them on a blanket playing with a wooden horse that Edgar had carved for him on a November evening, and their conversations about the town's future had the character of 2 people who have a stake in the place and a perspective worth offering. "It will be a different town in 5 years," she said one evening, watching the smoke from new construction rising over the rooftops. "Will that be bad?" he asked. She thought about it. "Not bad," she said. "Just different. More children for the school. More people who need what a community has to offer. More people who need to be told what honest dealing looks like." She glanced at him. "My father will be busy." "Your father is always busy," Edgar said. "He would not have it otherwise." She leaned against Edgar's shoulder the way she had come to do in these porch evenings, his arm coming around her naturally, James Silas making happy sounds at the wooden horse, the creek running in the early dark. "Do you know what I am thinking?" she said. "You are thinking about the library," he said, because he knew her. She laughed. "I am thinking we need more books," she said. "If this town is going to be what it seems like it is going to be, we need more than 8. How many do you want?" She thought about this with genuine seriousness. 50 to start," she said. "And a proper room for them, not the church hall." He was quiet for a moment. "The schoolhouse has the second room," he said, "now that Clara is teaching in it, but the building could be extended." "A library and a school in the same building," she said. "It is not a novel idea," he said. "It is actually the sensible one." She tilted her head up to look at him. "You are very useful," she said, with the warmth that meant something larger than the words. He kissed the top of her head. "I try to be," he said. They built the library extension onto the schoolhouse in the spring of 1882, with the help of the congregation and the new neighbors who had arrived ahead of the railroad. And by the time the first train came through Harlan Creek on a Saturday in June of 1882, pulling a plume of smoke, and a sense of the modern world arriving at speed, the schoolhouse had a library room with 63 books on proper shelves that Edgar had built and Beatrice had cataloged and labeled in her clear handwriting. And the children of Harlan Creek could take any of them home for 2 weeks at a time, with the care of readers who understood they were borrowing something valuable. The train's arrival was a genuine occasion, the whole town turning out to watch it pull in, and Edgar stood with Beatrice on the platform with James Silas on his shoulders so the boy could see over the crowd, and the steam and the noise and the sheer size of the locomotive produced in James Silas a state of pure wonder that expressed itself as a sustained, wordless shout, which made Edgar laugh and Beatrice cover her ears and then laugh too, and Reverend Wilcox, standing nearby, looked at his daughter and son-in-law and his grandson, and had the expression of a man counting his blessings and finding the count satisfying. The months rolled forward into 1883 with the peaceful quality of a life that has found its shape and is now filling it. The town grew, the school grew, the library grew, Peavy Creek Farm grew, the herd expanding to 30 head, which was a modest but genuinely viable operation, and Edgar took on Davy Crane, who had now married Anna Hartwell and needed regular wages, as a part-time hand, and the arrangement suited them both. James Silas learned to walk and then to run, and then to get into everything within reach, which was everything, because his mother's practical intelligence and his father's quiet determination combined in him to produce a child of relentless curiosity who needed to understand how every object worked by taking it apart, which was both admirable and frequently inconvenient. He had Edgar's dark eyes and Beatrice's directness, and at 2 years old he had already established a personality that suggested the adults in his life were going to have to be at their best to keep up with him. In the fall of 1883, Beatrice told Edgar on a Friday morning over coffee that they were going to have a second child, and this time she said it with the full ease of someone who has done this before and is glad to be doing it again. And Edgar received it with the warmth that had grown over 3 years of marriage into something that was less the sharp heat of the new feeling and more the steady warmth of a fire that is properly banked and intended to burn a long time. And it was in its own way more moving than the first announcement had been. The second child, a daughter, arrived in the spring of 1884, healthy and loud, and they named her Margaret after Beatrice's mother. And the Reverend came out to the farm the Sunday after she arrived and held his granddaughter in the same kitchen where he had held his grandson, with the same expression of a man who understands completely that he has been given more than he perhaps deserved, and is grateful to the God he has served long enough to trust this judgment. James Silas received his sister with mixed feelings that settled within 2 weeks into a proprietary affection, pointing at her with the authority of a small person who has appointed himself the relevant expert on this subject and stands ready to explain it to anyone who asks. Beatrice returned to teaching 4 weeks after Margaret was born, because she was Beatrice Wilcox Weston and the children needed their teacher, and Clara Stokes had managed bravely, but the upper grades were waiting, and she carried Margaret to the schoolhouse the same way she had carried James Silas, in a basket near the desk, while Harlan Creek's children learned to read and reckon and think carefully about the world. Edgar brought lunch to the schoolhouse twice a week, because it seemed like a sensible thing to do, and the children thought it was wonderful to see Mr. Weston arrive with a basket at midday, and James Silas, who had started attending the school's lessons himself at 4, was privately thrilled to have his father appear and privately worked very hard to appear as though this was ordinary. The years settled and deepened. Reverend Wilcox preached his sermons and visited his family and watched Harlan Creek become the larger town it had become with the considered attention of a man who understands that change requires shepherding. And he shepherded it in his way, which was to keep saying the things that mattered regardless of whether the audience was 10 people or 100. He aged with the grace of a man who has a purpose, silver moving further into his hair, but his voice maintaining its particular authority, and his directness with people never losing its quality. Edgar continued to expand the farm, slowly and with care, bringing the herd to 50 head by 1885 and adding a second barn that winter, which he built with Davy Crane and 2 new hands from the neighboring farms, men who had come west with the railroad and stayed because the land was good and the community was honest, which was what Edgar's land and community had always been. He was not a wealthy man by any standard that would have registered in the cities, but he was a prosperous man by the standard that mattered to him, which was the standard of owing nothing and owning what he had and knowing exactly where he stood in the world. The library reached 112 books by 1886, which Beatrice considered a genuine milestone and marked with a small celebration for the school's students, during which each child was given a bookmark that she had made herself from pieces of calico and asked to choose any book from the shelves to take home that week. Edgar watched her run this little ceremony from the back of the library room, Margaret on his hip and James Silas beside him watching his mother with the attentive respect of a 6-year-old who has figured out that his mother is extraordinary. And Edgar thought, as he often did in these moments, about the Thursday afternoon in late April of 1879, when he had ridden into Harlan Creek on his roan horse and walked into Clement Hodges's general store to buy flour and beans and coffee. And the woman with the dark braid and the list in her hand had nearly walked into him, and then looked up at him with those brown eyes that held no apology in them, and how everything that came after had followed. From that moment, with the kind of inevitability that only makes sense when you are looking backward at it. On a summer evening in 1886, 7 years after Edgar had first ridden into Harlan Creek, he and Beatrice sat on the porch of the house on Peavy Creek and watched the late light move across the pasture, where the cattle stood in the long grass and the creek bent and sparkled in the distance. James Silas was inside doing the reading that Beatrice had assigned him, which he was doing with the reluctant energy of a 7-year-old who would rather be outside, and Margaret was asleep, having fallen directly into unconsciousness after supper with the thoroughness of a toddler who had fully committed to the day. Beatrice had her hands around her coffee cup and her feet tucked up under her on the chair the way she did in private moments, unself-consciously, and Edgar was watching the sky to the west where the last of the sunset was still burning along the edge of the land. "I was thinking today," she said, "about when you first came into the store." He turned to look at her. "Were you?" "I was thinking that you almost did not stop in Harlan Creek. You said you were not certain whether you were staying." "That is true. What made you certain?" He was quiet for a moment, the way he was sometimes quiet, working out what he wanted to say rather than saying the first thing that came to him. "You nearly walked into me," he said finally, "and then you looked up at me and there was not one piece of apology in your face. You had somewhere to be and I was temporarily between you and it, and you were not going to pretend otherwise." He paused. "I thought that was the most honest thing I had ever seen a person do." She looked at him for a moment. "You stayed in Harlan Creek because I almost walked into you. I stayed because of what I saw in your face when you did not," he said. "It seemed like the kind of thing worth staying for." She was quiet. The last of the sunset moved along the horizon, burning down from orange into the blue-gray of the coming dark. The cattle moved slowly in the pasture. The creek ran with its patient sound. "I am glad you stayed," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day of my life." She reached over and took his hand the way she did on porch evenings, her fingers familiar and warm in his. And they sat together while the stars came out over Harlan Creek, and the porch light threw its warm circle into the dark. And inside the house, Their son was reading his assigned pages with the stubborn application of a child who will grow up to love books whether he knows it yet or not. And their daughter slept with her hands unclenched and her breathing even, and the fire was banked against the evening cool. And the house on Peavy Creek stood solid and well-made on its land, and the spring ran clear in the pasture, and the library had 112 books, and the schoolhouse had 27 children who came 3 mornings a week to learn what Beatrice had to teach them, and the First Baptist Church at the end of Harlan Creek's Main Street stood white and plain in the Texas night with the Reverend's lamp burning in his study window as he prepared his Sunday sermon. And all of it was real and built by hand and freely chosen, and none of it was finished, which is the most important thing of all. There was more to come. There would be more years of good work and difficult seasons, more conversations on the porch and more Sunday dinners under the cottonwoods, more letters from Raphael in Uvalde, and more visits from Davy Crane and his growing family, more students in the schoolhouse and more books on the library shelves, and more mornings when the Texas light came through the east-facing kitchen windows exactly as Edgar had promised it would, and found the two of them at the table with their coffee talking about whatever needed talking about, the small practical matters and the large philosophical ones, the way two people talk when they have decided to spend their lives paying attention to each other and have found that the attention is always worth giving. James Silas Weston grew into a boy who loved horses and mathematics in equal measure, which his father considered a sensible combination, and his mother considered a starting point. Margaret Weston grew into a girl of fierce will and enormous laughter, who inherited her mother's directness and her father's patience in proportions that would serve her exceedingly well in whatever life she made. The Reverend Silas Wilcox preached for another 12 years in the First Baptist Church of Harlan Creek, and watched his congregation grow with the town, and taught his grandchildren to read from the Bible on Sunday afternoons, with the same deliberate patience he had brought to everything. And when he finally set down his calling at 70 years of age in excellent health, and moved to the room that Edgar had built for him on the east end of the house on Peavy Creek, he did it with the serenity of a man who has done the work he was given to do, and done it honestly. The house on Peavy Creek held all of them in those years, easily and with room to spare, and the kitchen got the morning light every day the sun came up, which in Texas is most days, and on the mornings when the clouds came in and the light was gray instead of gold, Edgar made the coffee and Beatrice made the biscuits, and the children came to the table loud and hungry and alive, and the Reverend sat in his chair by the window and said the blessing, and whatever the light was doing outside. Inside the kitchen on Peavy Creek it was warm. That was the particular miracle of it. Not the grand story of a cowboy who rode into a town and refused to keep the respectful distance that every other man maintained, though that was how it had begun. Not the wedding in the white church, or the land purchased, or the house built, or the children born. The miracle was the ordinary mornings, compounded daily into a life, the coffee and the biscuits and the light and the conversation, and the steady presence of a man who had ridden into Harlan Creek on a Thursday in April of 1879, not entirely sure whether he was staying, and had found, in the space of one nearly collided moment with a woman who held no apology in her face, the answer to a question he had not quite known he was asking. He was staying. He had always been going to stay. He just needed a direction, and Beatrice Wilcox had been the direction, clear and true, from the first moment he had the sense to look.